Well, 'tis the season, or at least it was when I started this script. It's mid-January now, so that's kind of shot, and to be honest, I've never actually seen this movie, but I guess a lot of people like it, and I'm told that It's a Wonderful Life is the quintessential Christmas film. That's why it's been broadcast nationwide every year for over half a century, and released in pretty much every home video format under the sun. People have enjoyed this movie on 8 and 16mm film, Betamax and VHS, Laserdisc, Blu-ray, and now UHD and streaming services. However you want it, you can probably get it. Which is not to say that it came out on everything. I actually checked this. There were no releases on Video 8, CED, Video 2000, HD DVD, Movie CD, or Video Now, but if you owned a player for any successful format, you could rest assured it would not sit idle at the family Christmas party. However, up until the first DVD edition was released in 1998, you couldn't possibly have played it on your PC. Oh, right. About that, in case the joke isn't obvious, and I guess it really can't be since you can't see any of the components involved, what you're looking at here is a 1993 era PC with a 486 CPU, a 200 megabyte hard drive, a 2-speed CD-ROM, and Windows 3.1, and that PC is playing an actual movie. This isn't a brief clip like you'd see in Encarta. It's not a slideshow with a soundtrack attached. This is a full, uncut theatrical film, and it's playing from an ordinary CD, not a DVD and not some special format. And if you asked most people, they'd tell you that this was, if not impossible, certainly not a thing that ever happened. CPUs weren't fast enough, codecs weren't good enough, and CDs weren't big enough for anyone to bother releasing movies this way. And if you have any doubts, just Google movies on CD-ROM. You won't get much. But, of course, not much isn't nothing. You will very likely come across VideoCD and find that it's exactly what I'm saying didn't exist, a format for putting movies on CD-ROM. And that's fair. VCD wasn't very successful in this country, but it did exist. It was successful in some places, and it even got a release of It's a Wonderful Life. But it wasn't actually meant to be played on a computer, and it's not what you're seeing here. I do think it's important, though, to establish what VideoCD was for any of this to make sense. And now that we're through the intro, I'm gonna get rid of this monitor because it's really in the way. You know what else is in the way? This computer. All right, we'll get back to him later. Let's get some media here. This is not a video CD, but this is. The format was introduced by Philips in 1993, and it flopped pretty promptly, at least in the US. I don't want to get into this too deep, but in short, VCDs sold just fine in a number of other countries, mostly in East Asia. This copy of Face Off, I think, was sold in either Hong Kong or the Philippines. And I also have an Indian animated film here, which I believe came out in 2006. Now, these were very popular in those places because they offered features that were uniquely appealing due to the geography, supposedly. People say these are more resistant to high humidity than VHS. I've never heard that from the horse's mouth, but it seems to be the excuse most people give for why they were so popular in like Southeast Asia and whatnot. And they were also appealing in those economies because, frankly, they're extremely cheap compared to tape and even DVD when that came along. Now, I think these actually continued to come out for quite a bit longer than 2006, but for US consumers, they pretty much lasted like a year because they really offered nothing to convince people here to replace VHS, which was already extremely popular. For one thing, the runtime on VideoCD was so short that every movie came on at least 2 discs, sometimes more. For instance, I've got Face Off here, and it comes on 1, 2, 3 CDs. And you had to actually get up from the couch and swap discs physically in the middle of the film. Now, short runtimes, I'll remind you, are what many people believe led to Betamax's demise almost 20 years before this came out. So VCD was fairly doomed from the get-go. Although, to be fair, we should acknowledge that Laserdisc had the same limitations. Laserdiscs were pretty cool, but the problem is they too had very short runtime, so you usually had to flip them over in the middle of a movie. And a lot of movies actually came on more than one disc, sometimes as many as 3 or 4. Nonetheless, Laserdisc was pretty successful, and that's because it offered quality and feature set advantages which partly made up for the limited runtime, at least as far as film enthusiasts were concerned. VCD, on the other hand, didn't really offer anything. It had almost no additional features compared to VHS, and its picture quality was, if anything, slightly inferior. So all these problems added up to a product that American buyers had no interest in. The casual viewers didn't want to swap discs, and the enthusiasts didn't want a crappy picture. So in my perception, the only reason that video CD existed in the first place is because Philips, who had largely invented the compact disc in the first place and had huge factories churning them out, wanted an excuse to sell more compact discs. Video CDs, after all, were pressed on completely ordinary CD-ROMs. This one is gold for some reason, and I have no idea why that is, but most video CDs just look like totally normal CD-ROMs because they are. Technically, they are a slightly different format called CD-ROM XA, a variation that increases their effective capacity, but since most drives could read that, who's counting? The contents of video CDs are just conventional ISO 9660 data that you could actually read on a normal PC, and CD-ROM drives were rapidly becoming standard PC equipment, so you may very well have tried that. To wit. There we go. Tooljar is running Windows 3.1. So if you pop this disk in your machine and then you go into File Manager and take a look at the contents, you'll find there's a whole bunch of miscellaneous files on here, none of which you can make any sense of. But the bulk of it is 2 files in the MPEG AV folder. And I kind of got caught by surprise here because all the other video CDs I tested, these were just called .mpg. But trust me, this is the same thing, just with a different file extension. The point is, these are just MPEG files. And we all know good old MPEG, right? That's the ancient forerunner of all modern video formats, the thing we used back when PCs were too slow to play good video. So thus far, this is looking very much like a PC-oriented format, but let's just go ahead and play one of these files, shall we? We'll open Windows Media Player, and we'll just go in and pick one of these. Ah, there we go. That's, well, that's about 2 frames per second, I think, maybe 3. It's totally unwatchable at any rate, and this is what the experience would have been like for, I think, everyone. I admit this is a somewhat low-end machine for the era. I think the Pentium was out, but even then, MPEG's computational complexity was actually too high for any contemporary general-purpose CPU that I'm aware of to decode it in real time. You just couldn't do this. This is what it would have been like on pretty much any PC. Which isn't to say it's impossible to play a video CD on your computer. In fact, if I just go to the device menu here and pick the video CD movie option, we reload, hit play, and would you look at that, it's now playing perfectly. I can even full screen it with no trouble. But this is only possible because of trickery. You see, my first test was using something called CompCore SoftPeg, a once popular software-based MPEG decoder, but what we're using now is the Sigma Real Magic, a fixed-function hardware decoder, basically a single chip that does all the hard work of decompressing the video, so the CPU doesn't even have to touch it. I'll almost certainly talk more about this card in a later video, but it's only here today to prove a point. The only way you could have watched a video CD on your PC in 1993 is if you had a CD-ROM drive, a sound card, and an MPEG decoder, and each of those was rarer than the last. This PC came with none of the above. I added all of it from this kit, which included the Real Magic decoder card, a pair of speakers, and a CD-ROM drive. And the Real Magic acts as a sound card and CD-ROM controller as well, because it was assumed you had none of the above. And this whole setup would have run you about $500 in 1993 money. That's the equivalent of about $1,000 nowadays, and for that much, or even less, you could have just bought a Laserdisc player. Or, in fact, a dedicated video CD player. I imagine a lot of people don't even know these things exist, but plenty of them were made. I actually have 2. I've got a Philips model here. This is portable, so you can take it to a friend's house. This is very convenient for karaoke, which is actually what video CD was originally intended for before they decided to make it a movie format. The Sony, however, this one just goes under your TV like a VCR. It had a remote control, you plugged it in with composite, and this is how Philips expected you to play VCDs. In other words, while MPEG playback on a PC was possible and an interesting novelty, that's all it was, a novelty. Philips neither made nor endorsed any decoder cards, nor advertised this possibility as far as I can tell. This format was meant to replace VHS and to be used in the exact same way, viewed on your TV using a dedicated appliance. That was never going to happen in this country, but it was the intent. So now, I hope you can see the distinction I'm making. While there were movies on CD, nobody was making any that were expected to be played on a computer. Not at this time, that is. Sorry to interrupt, but I needed to clarify a point. I was so focused on that early 90s time frame that I accidentally dropped in some nevers here and there, which I didn't intend, because there was a format called movie CD, and it was exactly what I'm describing. It used CD-ROMs. It was meant to be played on an ordinary PC, and over 130 titles shipped on the format, many of them full-length feature films. However, it didn't exist until 1996. While I personally think the fact that this format postdates DVD makes it irrelevant to any narrative, certainly it seems to have persisted for years, so presumably someone was buying it, and thus the only factual point I can make is that nobody was making anything like this in the heyday of PC multimedia. And that makes sense. The PC market was growing, but it was still very tenuous, especially in terms of multimedia and graphics. Certainly, very few people would have been willing to buy add-on hardware of any kind. So for PC-based movies to be practical, the discs would need to be playable on a perfectly typical home PC with no significant modifications. To my knowledge, there were all of 5 products that ever fit that bill. You've already seen one, It's a Wonderful Life by Kinesoft, and I have 3 more here. We've got A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles, this is Spinal Tap by Spinal Tap, and A Night to Remember, and all 3 of these were produced by a company called Voyager. To reiterate, these are not video CDs. They're their own thing entirely, which I think makes this the smallest and most eclectic library for any failed format out there, but can we actually call this a format per se? I don't know that we can. Format implies a certain level of consistency, but that's not really what we have here, as you'll see. Since the target platform was the PC, which is a very poorly defined concept, there was no specific set of hardware, software, or performance metrics that developers could target. And conversely, there were no expectations from users as to what they would get out of a movie on CD. It could be basically anything the devs could dream up and get to run on a 486, and sure enough, all 4 discs here deliver vastly different experiences and value. The Kinesoft product is the first one I discovered though, so I'm gonna start with that. Now, there's a slim chance that you'll be aware of Kinesoft because they produced a number of PC video games, including some very early console ports for Windows, like Pitfall, The Mayan Adventure, and Earthworm Jim. These were very impressive for their time since they achieved nearly console-perfect performance before the release of DirectX, which is generally regarded as the technology that made high-speed action games possible on Windows. In fact, the wiki page on the company has an unsourced claim that says they actually worked with Microsoft to invent DirectX, which makes a lot of sense, but I couldn't find any corroborating proof of it online. Even the one citation they have, which is the website of Andy Glaister, one of the big names of the company, makes no mention of this fact. So I emailed Andy and asked about it, and he got back to me and confirmed that yes, the company and he himself actually were deeply involved in the creation of the original DirectX, and they eventually got acquired by Microsoft and continued to play a major role in its development for many years to come. They also ported Gex, so these were some real movers and shakers, okay?
It's tail time!
Despite playing such a pivotal role, though, Kinesoft is not very well documented online. Their game credits are on Moby Games, of course, but their non-game output is completely absent from the fossil record. And specifically, there's no mention anywhere of their CD Cinema collection, the logo for which appears on the CD case I'm holding and nowhere else as far as I know. Andy Glaister wasn't at the company when this was made, so he didn't mention it on his website. Very few publications wrote about it, and the few that did were almost all special interest periodicals like CD-ROM Today, CD-ROM Review, CD-ROM Revolution, and CD-ROM Entertainment. And we can probably safely assume that they were just scraping up every single release they could find to fill column inches and never even bothered testing this. The only mention I found in a general purpose publication from someone who sounded like they'd ever used it was an article in InfoWorld, and there it was used to test an NEC CD-ROM drive, which was the actual topic of the article. It was also written by a non-staff contributing editor who had been paid by NEC to shill the drive, so who knows if he even got out of bed that day. In other words, I get the feeling that besides myself, no one in the world really knows that this exists except the people who made it. And that's a shame because it is a very impressive prototype for a market that could and probably should have existed. You already saw basically what it is at the beginning of the video. It's a version of the movie It's a Wonderful Life that you can watch on your PC, but it's much more than that. Not physically, of course. I bought this as a loose jewel case from an Amazon seller of all people, so it lacks the original box, but I'm pretty sure there was nothing more to it than the discs themselves. And that's discs, plural, because while these aren't video CDs, Kinesoft still faced the same problem Philips did. CD just isn't a great format for video. It's simply not big enough. So the movie does span 2 discs, but I think this is less of a problem than it was for VCD, for reasons you'll soon see. Without further ado, let's take a look at it. We're going to use the exact same PC that I introduced earlier because it's contemporary. Both this and the CD came out in 1993. So let's pop this in the drive. And since auto run doesn't exist yet, we have to actually go into the program folder. I had to install a little stub to make this easier. And we'll fire that up. We get a little intro cinematic from Kinesoft. Then here we are in the program, and we go straight to the table of contents. And immediately you can see that there's a lot on offer here. Obviously, we've got the movie itself, part 1 and 2, since it's split into 2 discs. But there's also a ton of bonus content. And this would be a good moment to remind you, and we'll be coming back to this several times, that DVD wouldn't exist for another 3 years. And while Laserdiscs did have bonus content, there was no interactivity to it. What we're looking at here is basically the earliest known example of a DVD special features menu, and there are a lot of special features. The first 3 entries, for instance, we've got, well, the movie, obviously, but we also have the original theatrical trailer. We also have a bunch of boring trivia questions over here, but in between those, we've got a whole IMDb page worth of content. We've got the script. We've got reviews. We've got production history. We have the original short story, The Greatest Gift. We've got the cast list, including actors who didn't make the cut, and then a whole host of production and promotional stills. We're going to explore all of these, but before we click on anything, I just want you to drink this in. Go to your mind palace for a moment and create a reality where you're someone who just really loves this movie. Now erase Wikipedia from existence. Erase IMDb and Reddit and Blu-ray.com and all of social media and every DVD and Blu-ray release of this film. Erase every single resource that you might use to ask the question, who was the runner-up to play George Bailey, without walking to a library. Now you're in 1993, okay? Then imagine putting this disc into your computer and being presented with all of this. It's pretty amazing, right? Well, maybe. Maybe not, though. There were actually gobs of CDs that more or less looked like this. Prior to the video game explosion driven by the release of DirectX, I'd say the majority of CDs for, well, both Windows and Mac were reference material of some kind. I mean, there were the countless general-purpose encyclopedias, Encarta and whatnot, but there were also CDs on every specific topic you can imagine, like the Microsoft Wine Guide.
Hi, I'm Oz Clark. Welcome to the Microsoft Wine Guide. Use our guides to expand your experiences and horizons, and your pleasures.
Or Compton's Jazz, a Multimedia History. Or indeed, Microsoft's own movie guide, Cinemania. This came out originally in 1992. They released several more versions of it, but this would have been the newest one at the time. And it offers a vast amount of information on thousands of films. It's a very useful resource. Although, if we go pull up It's a Wonderful Life, it has credits, it has a synopsis, it has some production stills, but it doesn't mention who was the runner-up to play George Bailey. Cinemania is impressive for its time, but it's also rudimentary. It only uses about 200 of the CD's 650 megs to cover the whole breadth of the cinema industry up to that date. And even that amount of data had to have cost a tremendous amount in both effort and licensing. So it's no surprise that they stuck to the basics. There just wasn't room, time, or money to cover everything. Kinesoft's product, on the other hand, had only one job and 2 whole disks to do it with. That's 1.2 gigs of data when the average hard drive was only 200 megs. I'm sorry, that's 1.3 gigs of data. Whoops. Well, anyway, Microsoft's product could only spare a few kilobytes per film, but this one includes over 30 megs of data on just this one movie, not counting the film itself. In other words, this is clearly an enthusiast product aimed more at the Laserdisc crowd than the VHS casuals. But I digress. Let's see the damn film. This takes quite a while to load. It's like 30, 40 seconds, and I'm not really sure what it's doing because it's not running the CD-ROM right now. There we go. Now it's running the CD-ROM. This player interface is very odd looking at first. All we have is a big faded cast photo and several gray depressions. This is actually a pretty neat if unintuitive decision though. To keep the UI uncluttered, everything is hidden until you click on it. And then you can right-click on it to hide it again just for a less distracting interface. Discoverability wasn't really a priority in these days, as we can tell, but clearly they were thinking about UX. So if we show the VCR section, there's our playback controls, and if we just hit play, the movie starts. Now, naturally, I can't show too much of this due to content ID, but let's just skip to a point where we've got some action. There we go, this should be good. And you can see now that the video isn't the smoothest, but it is playing, and that's an accomplishment in itself. We'll discuss this more later when we look at the technical details, but the important thing is that while I do have that MPEG accelerator card in here, it is not using it. I tested this without the card in there. Trust me, this is being decoded directly on the CPU. And you can tell, it's pretty jerky. We can even see some image tearing, but you have to admit, this is watchable. And if we open the AV controls here, you can adjust the size of the image. And if we set it to the largest one, it takes over the entire screen, and it actually plays surprisingly smoothly. And this is because the program is now running in exclusive full screen mode. Thus, the video is no longer going through the Windows Display subsystem, and that saves a lot of CPU time. And there you have it. That's the trick. This is the movie, and you can watch it on your modestly equipped home computer. And I'll explain how this is possible later and the hurdles you might have encountered in the process. But let's finish assessing the product itself first, because the movie is only a small portion of what we have here. So full screen mode is definitely how you're expected to watch the movie. The purpose of the windowed view is just to seek to an interesting point in the film. And for that reason, we can also make this even smaller. If we're on an even slower computer, this will make things run considerably better, especially if you're on like a 386 or a really low-end 486. Now, I couldn't find the base system requirements for this thing, but I'd guess that was realistic, and I'll get into why I believe that later. But if you were on a machine that slow, this is the only mode it possibly could work in, so it's a good thing that it's here. The only other option under the AV section is, well, the volume. But if we go back to the VCR section here, we've got a full set of controls. As you saw, we can scrub to anywhere we want, or we can hold fast forward or rewind to seek around. We can also hit skip to jump between chapters. No, that's a lie. I'm sorry. Skip actually just skips forward or back by a few seconds. I could swear that jumped chapters before. We'll get to that. Anyway, we can also see the time index in either the timestamp or the number of frames, although there's a bug. This display is actually inverted. It's on frame count right now, and if we hit frame, then it shows us the time. Sadly, also, you can't click in this and type in a timestamp to jump to, a missed opportunity. Still though, as a video player, this is really solid. Like, I would say this is nicer than the contemporary Windows Media Player. But let's start getting into some real features here. If we expand the utilities section, this is exciting. We have search, bookmark, and a mystery icon, a secret tool that'll help us later. Bookmark does exactly what you think. This just lets you save a named spot in the movie to jump to later. Search, on the other hand, that's really something. Okay, for one thing, I lied to you. You can jump to either a frame number or a timestamp. They just didn't have that in the main UI. Nowadays, someone would do it. Back then, I'm not surprised that they didn't. But what's more intriguing is the full text search. Now, I don't know much about this movie. Like I said, I've never seen it, but I know there's a scene where George is looking for his car and can't find it. And I have no idea when that happens. So if I type in my car and hit find, takes a bit. It's been about 10 seconds at this point. We're up to about 20 seconds now. It's doing it. It's thinking. Boy, howdy, that's taken a while. Oh, there we go. Oh, okay. It's all the way over on disc 2. We're having the ribbon experience again. All right, that's one of the scenes, but it's not the one I'm looking for. I'm gonna hit find again. That's not it either. Let's hit it again. Ah, here it is. This is what I was looking for.
Well, this is where I left my car, and it isn't here.
A DVD can't do that. We just searched the movie for a line of dialogue. I don't even think streaming services have that feature. You starting to get why I made this video? The reason this is possible is made clear if we click on the mysterious icon, which takes us over to a copy of the shooting script and then jumps to the exact point we were at in the film. This is fully cross-referenced. Every line has a matching time index. So if I scroll forward a little bit and then I click the icon button again, it drops the needle right at the matching point in the movie. Again, could you do this on DVD? Well, sort of, in one direction. Like if you had, some sort of bodged together thing with thousands of linked menus, you could maybe have a script that can link to the movie, but it would never be this slick. It would never have full text search, and it would never go both ways. You wouldn't be able to jump from the movie back to the script. I'd like to say that Blu-ray is equally limited, but I don't really know. In any case, though, I'm pretty sure nobody ever did it. This is a really, really cool feature, and it still isn't common 32 years later. Now, the script interface itself is pretty basic. We've got the bookmark and search buttons again, and then a slightly confusing navigation UI. We've got these arrows down here, and the left and right arrows page up and down and then disappear after I click them. I swear this didn't happen when I was testing. Well, those are supposed to be the page up and down buttons. I don't know what's going on right now. But the up and down buttons skip you all the way to the top and bottom of the script, which seems like a great way to lose your place. And it also seems redundant because you've just got this scroll bar here, which allows you to flip through the whole thing freely, and you can page up and down that way, or you can go line by line using the buttons. So the arrows seem kind of unnecessary, but hey, it was probably the first thing they thought of. This whole interface is a little weird. Like, why isn't the scroll bar vertical? Wouldn't that make more sense? I'd blame it on lack of screen real estate, but they've got all this wasted space over here, so that's not it. I'm guessing the idea was that they're trying to simulate a book, so they're thinking that left and right is flipping pages, but I don't think it really plays. Whatever. I'm not going to criticize it too hard. It works once you figure it out. And it's not like there was a gold standard to compare to. They were inventing this as they went along. So that's the whole script interface. But these tabs on the right take us to other text-based sections. So we can go to the reviews. And this is just a collection of contemporary reviews of the movie from various publications. So if you're curious how it was received at the time, they've got an awful lot of info about that. We also have the film history section here. This offers a pretty lengthy retelling of the history of the film's production. This was apparently written by one Walter J. Podrzik, who I guess is a film historian. And then we have, again, The Greatest Gift. This was the original short story that eventually got adapted into the movie, and that's here in its entirety. So this is just about all the text-based content you could ask for. Let's go back to the video player here, though. The one section we haven't looked at yet is the index. This is where you can get to the chapters. I told you this thing had chapters. And if we go in here and pick one, it gives us a little thumbnail down here so you can tell if that's the one you're looking for. And I think this is cool. It leaves the context menu open so you can click through these without having to reopen it every single time like you would if they'd used a native Windows context menu. I thought that was really cool. So if that's the one you want, then you can just hit jump and it'll jump straight there. But the more interesting thing is that some of the chapters, when you select them, will light up this note button down here. And if we click that,
it's not unusual for a lead character to have a dramatic entrance, but Capper provides Jimmy Stewart a literal showstopper, a freeze frame. The heavenly voices provide the excuse, as they stop the action to give Clarence the opportunity to study George's face.
We get a commentary from, I believe, that same Walter Podrzik. At first, when I didn't realize who this was, it seemed kind of crackerjack. It was like, hey, we got some rando around the office to talk about the movie. You care about that, right? But now I realize that it's somebody who actually has standing in, the study of film history. And given that many of the principals had died at this point and that Kinesoft was a nobody who couldn't have gotten any of them to interview anyway, they couldn't exactly get a director's commentary on here. So that's everything for the player interface, but let's go back to the main menu here. So we saw everything up to this point, but if we take a look at the cast list, so this has the cast indexed two different ways. This tab has them sorted by the actors. You can pick whoever you want, and it'll jump right to them and then show you who they played. Or we can go over to the character index. And that'll give us the same information except indexed that way, right? But what's interesting about this is that if we pick a character who had an alternate in the running, we can click Consider. We get a list of every other person who was considered for this role, and there's actually quite a few of them in there. I did not realize this. Most of the characters I've looked at only had one alternate. I didn't even realize you could see a list. So yeah, quite a lot of information here. But here's my favorite part. If we go in and take a look at George Bailey, the Consider button does not light up because Jimmy Stewart was the only choice for this role. While it's commonly stated that Cary Grant was a runner-up, the reality seems to be that he was just vaguely involved in a very early stage of production. And in fact, the history section mentions this and refers to it as nothing more than studio legend. And I think this sort of highlights the value of this kind of product. I'm not sure if that's a fair take on how things went. Maybe he was closer to actually playing the role than this guy would credit, but at least it's a view formed by someone who bothered to dig in enough to get past the common wisdom, as it were. I'll touch on this more later, but I really get the impression this was made by people who were passionate and actually cared, and this, I think, is a reflection of that. The final major feature here is the film scrapbook. That's 3 different collections of photos. We've got behind the scenes, we've got promotional photos, and then we have stills that were shot on set during the filming. This is pretty straightforward, it's just a picture gallery, but they're much higher quality than the video itself, and they included a ton of them. I think it's 79 pictures in total, which is quite a few. And we have to consider again that there weren't really any other resources for getting this sort of thing at the time. I mean, no real internet to speak of, at least not for high resolution pictures like this. It was much harder to search, etc. The only way you really could have seen this sort of thing is by, again, going to the library and finding like a coffee table book that was just about this movie. So this is pretty cool. And the only real complaint I can think of is that there's no obvious way to export these to use them in something else. Although I guess in this era, there were fewer applications for that. And now that I think of it, they're probably just bitmaps on the CD, so you could probably extract them that way. I didn't check. Maybe I will, and I'll put some text up here that says whether that was possible or not. Anyway, that's the last major feature. There is, of course, one more. I wouldn't call this a major feature, but there is the trivia quiz section. We've got various quizzes on different segments of the movie, and yeah, they're exactly what you think they would be. So at this point, you've seen the whole thing, so let's talk about what this represented in its day. If we think back to our thought experiment earlier, what if there was no IMDb, no Wikipedia, etc., it's undeniable that 1993 was a dark era compared to now. But here's the thing. What I left out of that whole spiel was Laserdisc, which is a huge element, and we should talk about that for a moment. It's going to be more than a moment. It's going to be a few minutes. Let's just get into it. Laserdisc is now remembered as the enthusiast's format par excellence, but it didn't start out that way. The creators thought, just like Philips did with VideoCD, that this would just be a cheaper replacement for videotape. In fact, one of the difficulties they faced in early marketing was explaining to people why it was still worth buying despite its inability to record TV.
Does it record? No. LaserVision discs are pre-recorded, like records and books. They're for collecting video programs of the highest quality, for replay again and again. With LaserVision, the key is play in every sense of the word.
At the time that Laserdisc first came out in '78, that was tape's primary selling point, so this was probably a pretty tough sell. Tape also had much longer runtime. As I mentioned earlier, most Laserdiscs required you to manually flip the disc over halfway through and sometimes even swap discs. So it's no surprise that in the fullness of time, it only made its way into a very tiny percentage of households, while VHS eventually occupied more than 3/4. Due to its superior image and sound quality, however, Laserdisc became very popular with film buffs. For nearly 20 years, every movie lover that could afford it kept a Laserdisc collection. It was basically the 80s equivalent of Blu-ray. And the analogy holds because even today, DVDs continue to outsell both HD and UHD discs combined. Big Blu-ray collections aren't exclusive to enthusiasts, but they're certainly much more common in the homes of film nerds than, if you'll forgive me, normal people. As much as this may irk those of us who get really up in arms about resolution, it seems that most consumers don't really care about picture quality, and nothing's changed in that department in 40 years. And yet, Laserdisc was successful in its own right, largely because it became more specialized. Once publishers realized that the general public wasn't interested in the format, but that film buffs were, they started offering more and more enthusiast-oriented content. And you can actually see this evolution just by looking at the sleeves. The earliest releases, sold by MCA under the name DiscoVision, didn't even have the common decency to print the movie poster on the slipcover without covering it up with an ad for the format itself. A shockingly insulting and disrespectful practice, which I'm not sure I've seen in any other field. As time went on, though, the cover art started to displace the branding for the format, then that of the studio and publisher, and by the 90s, slipcovers had been completely taken over by a picture of the movie itself. Meanwhile, as the front covers became more artistic, the backs of the sleeves became more informative. First-generation discs carried little more than the blurb that you'd get on a VHS sleeve. Mid-era releases, however, included far more prose and analysis, and eventually the covers and liners became repositories of production notes, behind-the-scenes stills, and even communiques from the creators. My favorite example is the 1993 Laserdisc release of The Abyss, 1989. This came out in both letterboxed widescreen and cropped pan and scan editions, and that wasn't uncommon in itself on Laserdisc, but what was unusual is that the pan and scan version was specifically requested by James Cameron himself. His reasoning was that pan and scan offered better visual quality than letterboxing could due to the limited resolution of home video. And we could argue about this, he and I. He isn't factually wrong, I just think raw visual quality isn't as important as being able to see what's happening in the goddamn film. And I also don't believe there's any crossover between people who care about visual quality and people willing to watch a movie in 4:3. So I think this was a huge waste of time at best, but listen to how I'm talking, as if there's a dialogue here between me and one of the most famous directors in modern history. It's absurd to think that the guy who made Terminator 2 and Titanic cares what I think. The trouble is that he clearly does, and used the entire disc sleeve to make that clear. Most video releases, especially on VHS, just came from nowhere. They appeared out of the clouds. Nobody really knows who created them or why certain decisions were made. And if this were a VHS tape, there's no question it would be in pan and scan only, and we just have to assume that decision was made by some cynical, detached executive or apathetic transfer house employee, because there's no way it would be explained anywhere. It would just, be like that, and we'd never know why. Here, though, the director of the movie felt that the Laserdisc audience was sufficiently with it to demand or even deserve a direct personal explanation. And in fact, if you flip the sleeve over, there's a whole essay explaining why the special edition fundamentally alters the plot of the movie by restoring almost 30 minutes of footage that was never added to the theatrical run. Cameron explains why he cut out this subplot in the first place, why he thought it was a good idea then, and why he thinks this cut is a good idea now. It's an apology, a justification, and a bunch of inside baseball mixed up into a big, delicious bouillabaisse. And none of this information was available anywhere else that I know of. This is not copied from a book, okay? This is a letter written by the director to go on this Laserdisc sleeve. And it's addressed to you, the person who went out and bought the special edition because you'd spent 4 years hearing from your film nerd buddies about this mysterious alternate cut of the film, which in reality never actually existed. Cameron had never made it because he himself chose to remove those elements from the film. He says he had final cut authority, but it was his decision to strip out all this content to make something more approachable. So to make the special edition, he had to finish post-production on 28 minutes of footage, redoing the sound mixing and special effects and even bringing actors back for additional vocal recording. And it wasn't even in service of a new theatrical run. It was just for this Laserdisc. That's how differently Hollywood saw that audience. So it almost seems redundant at this point to point out that this same release also included an hour-long making-of video, production stills, concept art, and gobs of other things too numerous to mention. It's an absolute smorgasbord of background information. And other discs, especially those from the Criterion Collection, who got their start on this format, included even more valuable extras, like director interviews that couldn't be seen anywhere else. In fact, a lot of the bonus content that would later appear on DVDs was originally created for Laserdisc releases, and that is why I'm explaining all of this. DVDs brought tons of improvements over VHS, but I figure the things that drove mass adoption were mostly matters of convenience. The discs took up less space, they lasted longer, your player couldn't eat them, they didn't take time to rewind, and they were cheaper or the same price. After that, however, there were a bunch of objective upgrades, higher image quality, multiple audio and subtitle tracks, and chapter skip and select features, most of which even Laserdisc couldn't deliver. And of course, there was much better support for bonus features thanks to the menu system, and since the discs were smaller and cheaper to make, it was easier to include a second disc just for bonus content. What all this means is that DVD was better than VHS and Laserdisc combined, and this had the effect of collapsing both formats into one. Instead of making two versions, one for casuals, one for enthusiasts, home video conversion houses could do just one version that satisfied everyone. And sure enough, film buffs embraced DVD with a passion. To this day, there are still movies whose biggest fans say are best watched on DVD because the Blu-rays have inferior transfers. But at the same time, suddenly tons of average, everyday people were getting the enthusiast versions of every movie they bought. And that probably created a lot of new enthusiasts. Surely most DVD owners have never watched a movie with the commentary on or watched the making of video afterwards, but what's amazing about DVD is that those things are still there. You don't need to go out of your way to get them. They're just a button press away. This was a huge change from the VHS era when you'd have to send away for a making of tape, assuming one even existed, or buy the movie on Laserdisc. And I mean, I'm speaking for myself here. I consider myself a pretty insufferable film nerd. And the reason I'm like that is because when I rented a DVD of The Abyss, 1989, I found out that it had a commentary on just how the special effects were made as a subtitle track. I discovered this by accident and I was captivated by it. And I watched the whole movie a couple times with that turned on. I wouldn't have gone looking for that, but the fact that it was there meant that I could just accidentally stumble on it and discover that was something I was interested in. And I suspect this happened to a lot of people. But none of it could happen until DVD came out in 1996. So back in 93, when Kinesoft released this disc, the most accessible source for deeper info on this movie was still the Laserdisc, a perennially obscure format that almost nobody had unless they were already a huge movie nerd. Now, this is not to say that PCs were more commonplace. I mean, CD-ROM equipped machines were probably considerably less common than Laserdisc players, but they were at least in the houses of people who didn't already consider themselves cinephiles. Hate that word. And since CD-ROM uptake was accelerating at this point, this product represents an improvement in accessibility over the way it had been for decades. Like, I've already established that there was probably never a huge market for films on CD at all, but had there been, a lot of people would have ended up buying them because, hey, I've already got a PC, that might be fun, only to find out that there was a lot more on the disc than just the movie itself and possibly get a lot more into it than they expected. All this to say that had Kinesoft just released the movie, that might have been an interesting stunt, but not actually very interesting in itself. But the fact that they applied a Criterion Laserdisc level of attention to detail, that's remarkable to me. And I really think it deserves that description because this whole thing radiates passion and care. Consider this. If the film they'd transferred had been, say, The Abyss, 1989, they probably would have focused more on production aspects, the special effects, the sets, the difficulties the actors faced. But since It's a Wonderful Life is a heartwarming American classic, they focused on the characters and the impact on American culture, even including that trivia section that you have to imagine was intended for use in the blandest possible domestic scenarios, probably involving kids. Even as someone who has no affinity for this movie, I can tell this is the right treatment. Clearly, nobody at Kinesoft was asleep at the wheel. They all thought about the best way to present this specific movie, and I think they did a bang-up job. But if that's the case, then what happened? Why weren't there any more CD Cinema Collection releases, and why was the only one this movie? Well, the most obvious answer is probably cost, though not for the reason you might initially think. As the oft-retold story goes, the copyright on It's a Wonderful Life partially lapsed in 1974 due to a clerical error, and this is supposedly why it became an enduring American classic. TV stations only had to pay minimal royalties to the author of the original short story to broadcast it, and that made it very cheap Christmas entertainment, which eventually became enshrined as a tradition simply because it had been happening for a very long time. This situation eventually got resolved, but not until 1993. So, we can imagine that Kinesoft released their product while the legal situation was still in flux, making the licensing cost $0, and this is what I thought until very late in the editing process. You see, one of the things I was going to show you last was this booklet in the front of the jewel case. It looks like one of those super cheap fold-out manuals, but in fact, it's sort of a poster. Like, I don't think you'd hang this on your wall, but it does tell the basic story of the film's production. And, well, I think it just kind of makes the whole thing look glossier and more professional. They didn't need to do this, but I think they did because they were just proud of what they'd made. In any case, though, near the end of this tale, it does touch on the whole copyright situation and points out that it had been resolved at this point. Republic Pictures had regained the copyright, and down at the bottom, it says under license from Republic Pictures Corp. So they did have to pay for it. But we can imagine it still didn't cost very much compared to a lot of other movies. It was also thoroughly documented at this point, and widely appreciated, of course, and, you know, it was possible to get the rights at all, which wasn't true for everything. Publishing The Abyss, 1989, would have required these nobodies to negotiate terms with James Cameron. Good luck with that. There could be other reasons, you know, maybe Kinesoft's staff just loved this movie, but in any case, we can assume that they intended to issue other releases. It's the CD Cinema collection, after all, so what happened to the rest? Well, as I said earlier, Andy Glaster wasn't there for this product's development, but he was there long enough to tell me that right after they released this, they dropped their first video game and promptly realized that was a much more lucrative market, so they pivoted and never looked back. And this comes as no surprise. I mean, consider the immense effort and cost that went into this project. They had to digitize the movie, make it playable on low-end computers, scan photos, transcribe the script and reviews, cross-link the script with the video. It had to have taken thousands of man-hours to produce this thing, and that was reflected in the price tag. $79.95. That'd be $175 in today's money, which is Blu-ray box set of major motion picture pricing. And that really puts the nail in the coffin, doesn't it? For comparison, the Criterion Laserdisc edition of this movie was $39.95, almost half as much. And even if it had cost more, you'd really be getting more. It may not have included the script, but it did come with a full-length commentary track synced to the movie, a bunch of production stills and text that are probably identical to the ones we just saw, and a video seminar with director Frank Capra, because it was mastered in 1987 when he was still alive. And let's not forget, it also had video quality twice that of the Kinesoft release or better. And on that topic, let's finally get technical. How did Kinesoft pull this off when VideoCD sends this PC to the Shadow Realm? Well, you might find this a bit disappointing, but as it turns out, it's nothing revolutionary. It's just very pragmatic. If we go in and open this disk in File Manager, there's a bunch of files here, but the disk is dominated by one 590 megabyte AVI. And if we just double click that, it opens and plays in Windows Media Player. The included app is performing no magic tricks. It's just a basic video for Windows interface. What makes this all possible is nothing more than a codec that everyone already had. If we take a look at the file details, we find that Kinesoft encoded this in Cinepack, the default codec for video for Windows, as well as the first couple versions of QuickTime. It's been dead for decades at this point, but it was quite common in the 90s, having been introduced in 91, specifically with the intent of being decoded on contemporary mid-range CPUs while being streamed from the single-speed CD-ROMs common in the era. This is reflected in the bitrate. The AVI runs at 1195 kilobits per second, while a 1x CD-ROM delivered exactly 1200 kilobits per second. That's a 5 kilobit margin, which is pretty impressive. I mean, who trusts any storage device to deliver its rated speed that precisely? But apparently, they did. I'm really curious how reliable this was, and I wanted to test it, but after a couple weeks of trying to scrape up a single-speed CD-ROM, I concluded that they are extremely rare and almost all of them are now broken. But it sure seems like all the contemporary manufacturers were willing to bank on this, so it probably worked more often than not. They were so confident, in fact, that they enshrined this in a standard. A lot of multimedia CDs of this era carried a logo like this. That's the Multimedia PC or MPC specification that was introduced in 1990 to try to create a defined platform for multimedia content on the PC to address the exact problem that I mentioned earlier, that the PC was a moving target. They wanted to establish a stationary target, sort of the way that the Steam Deck is now a quality option you can pick in video games. This was a really valiant effort, and it seemed to take, at least for a bit. In fact, a lot of contemporary magazines would actually refer to it as a distinct platform. Instead of saying Mac/PC, they would actually say Mac/MPC. Now, I can't find proof that Kinesoft was targeting the MPC platform outright. There's no logo on here for it, but I strongly suspect there was on the outer box. If we go in here and take a look at the README, we scroll down a little bit to the troubleshooting section. This says if you're having problems with playback, to make sure that your CD-ROM drive is MPC compatible. Now, there were multiple versions of the spec released over time, and I think MPC2 had come out like a year before this. But the first one demanded a 16 MHz 386SX, 2 megs of RAM, a 30 meg hard drive, 256 color 640x480 graphics, a sound card, Windows 3, and a single speed CD-ROM. Now, none of that is mentioned here, but it does say that the CD-ROM should have sub-second seek times and should demand no more than 40% of your CPU power. That's what it says in the MPC spec, and it's what it says here. So I think they were probably targeting the original 1990 version of MPC. Now, I haven't looked into MPC as thoroughly as I'd like to yet, but I have the feeling that it was sort of like Microsoft's minimum specs for Windows Vista. You could run that OS with 512 megs of RAM and an 800 megahertz processor and 20 gigs of disk space, in that it would install and run without immediately crashing. But it was unusably slow and cramped, and I suspect the MPC apps were as well on minimum spec machines. To wit, I tested this same disk on a 25 megahertz 386DX, and it was even a little bit above the specs. It had an accelerated graphics card and a slightly faster CPU than they targeted. It came nowhere close to full frame rate. I mean, it sort of worked in the tiniest window size, but the medium window didn't look too hot, and in full screen, totally unwatchable. With that said, however, we do have to acknowledge that it is playing at all on a machine that really shouldn't be able to decode any form of video, so this is quite the achievement. But to get there, it obviously had to be pretty heavily compromised. The movie is encoded at 320x240 and just 12 frames per second. So even if we play it on my massively overpowered modern computer, it doesn't look much smoother than on our 486. And this really puts VideoCD in perspective. Sure, it needed an expensive decoder card, but it also ran at the full 2997 FPS of deinterlaced NTSC video, and that was just simply impossible with CPU decoding, regardless of resolution or anything. It also offered 44 kilohertz stereo sound, whereas this offers only 11 kilohertz mono, which even for the era was pretty pathetic. I'm not sure it matters all that much for this movie, since it probably never had a stereo soundtrack and 1940s audio recording techniques were pretty bad to begin with, but it does shine a very different light on the viability of the CD cinema collection. Imagine watching The Abyss, 1989, at 12 FPS with mono 11 kilohertz audio. That would look like this.
What's the problem, 190?
All hell must be breaking loose up there. This cable's pissing me off. Can't get a grip on it.
All right, everybody break for impact. Close all the exterior hatches, let's move, let's go, go!
Yeah, there's no way James Cameron would let you release that. This approach could maybe work for a few movies, it sort of does for this one, but not for most, I think. It's probably just not watchable in most people's standards. And to be honest, I had to do some shenanigans to get it to run even as well as it does. This software didn't really work out of the box. When I first installed it, I got like 4 to 6 frames per second, and I wasn't sure why. Not having the full manual, I wasn't sure what specs they'd actually targeted, but when I tested on my EduQuest, which has a 100 megahertz 486 DX4, it ran like gangbusters. So I thought, okay, maybe it's a CPU speed issue. I happen to have a 486 DX2 sitting around, which is 50 megahertz, twice the speed of the stock processor, and a bit more contemporary than that DX4. So I popped that in my Packard Bell, retested, and it was still unwatchable. I jumped through many hoops. I second-guessed everything, even the CD-ROM drive. This is a very old model with a dedicated interface card, and I'm pretty sure it eats up a lot of CPU time with interrupts, so I trimmed the video down until it would fit on the hard drive, copied it over, removed the CD-ROM entirely, and played the file with no improvements. Finally, I turned my suspicions to the graphics card. This machine's onboard video is a horrible old Oak OTI 077. It's barely even documented online. I get the impression that it's pretty crusty though, and I'd actually noticed that when I fired up Windows, it took a really long time to draw the desktop, so maybe the fill rate on the card was just terrible. Well, this machine lacks VESA local bus, so I couldn't put a proper high-end card in it, but I installed the best 16-bit ISA card I could find, a Trident TVGA 8900CL, and would you believe it? That was the ticket. My desktop suddenly drew in a lot faster, and when I played the movie, I got something much closer to the intended frame rate. Even when I went back to the stock 25 MHz CPU, it continued to work a lot better than it had in the first place. Still noticeably jerky and with a lot more visible tearing, but watchable. So apparently the problem all along was the graphics. Unfortunately, Packard Bell was not the only clone manufacturer using the cheapest video chips they could find. So based on this experience, I have to conclude that while the CD might have been playable on a lot of contemporary hardware, you couldn't really know until you tried. It was a crapshoot. And if it didn't work, you didn't really get any solutions from the vendor. Neither the NPC spec nor the README for this program say anything about graphics fill rate or acceleration. You just have to guess that it was your video card at fault. And given that this card almost certainly cost over $100 new, shotgun troubleshooting would have been out of the question. And even if you didn't have that problem, to get a really satisfying fluidity of motion, it seems like you'd need at least a 50 MHz CPU. That obliterates the MPC specifications. It's way past them, and it would have added about $500 to the cost of this machine. That one, however, I'm going to hand wave, because by 93, even if PCs were far more common than they were in the 80s, they still weren't the everyday appliances they would become a few years later. And I think anyone bothering to go out and buy an $80 multimedia CD-ROM probably hadn't bought the bottom of the line trim package. Packard Bell sold this same machine in 50 and 66 MHz configurations, and I think there's a good chance the target audience would already have one of those. And at some point, we just have to acknowledge the brazenness of what was being attempted here. This is 1993's equivalent of a game with RTX path tracing. It couldn't be done well on any extant hardware, so if you expected it to work on your WordPerfect appliance, too bad. It's a bummer that you didn't understand the realities of the industry. The trouble, though, is that it just kind of makes the product pointless. I mean, the crossover between person who loves It's a Wonderful Life enough to flip through all the actor biographies and person buying the equivalent of a $2,500 gaming rig couldn't have been all that wide. I suspect this disc would have been far more practical and affordable as a sort of movie companion. Basically, all the special features minus the actual full motion video, you'd just follow along with it on a normal Laserdisc or tape. They could even give you time codes and thumbnails on each page of the script to help you find your place. That would have taken up a fraction of the space, saving a whole CD, and been much easier on your PC. Also, the resulting product probably could have been sold for $29.95 or even less, and I'm pretty sure I've seen discs like that floating around for various classic movies, though I can't for the life of me find any at the moment. I strongly suspect, though, that if Kinesoft had gone forward with this series, the rest of the titles would have been a lot closer to that concept. It's just easier and probably has broader appeal. That said, though, I think there's really no mystery as to why they didn't go any further or why nobody seems to have noticed that it existed. Except I stumbled on something that makes me wonder if someone did notice this in its day. I can't figure out how I first learned of Kinesoft's release of this movie. I discovered it last year, but even by now it's shrouded in mystery. I apparently told a friend that I'd seen this in a Computer Chronicles episode, but I've been through my watch history and skimmed about 30 episodes of the show that I might have had reasons to look at, and I can't find it anywhere. And there's hardly any references to it anywhere else, so I don't know how this happened. But when I Googled it initially back in 2023, to my great satisfaction, I found a result from the Internet Archive with an ISO file I could download. Except when I clicked on it, the disc looked like this. That's definitely not what we have here, and there's only one of them. It turns out this was misidentified. The uploader must have Googled Wonderful Life on CD, found a brief description of this product in a magazine, and copied and pasted it without paying much attention. Before you search for it, yes, there is a proper copy of the Kinesoft version on there, but only because I tracked down the physical disc, bought it, and uploaded it myself. At the time, there was only this, and it's clearly not the same thing. Well, let's see what it actually is. If we open this disk in File Manager, it contains almost nothing other than a set of AVI files, and if we open one of them, This is the whole movie, once again, beginning to end, but it's been cut down to within an inch of its life, so it can be crammed onto a single CD. Naturally, that means it lacks all the special features. There's nothing on here except those AVIs and a copy of the video for Windows Runtime. But the video itself has also been chopped up into 5 files for some reason, and the contents are even more deeply compromised than the other version. This is not struggling to decode on this CPU. This is the actual frame rate. It is 4 frames per second at a resolution of just 160 by 120. That barely counts as video. If you hadn't seen the movie before, I don't know if you could make sense of what's going on from this. 4 frames per second is just too slow to create an illusion of motion. A lot of high-speed actions are lost completely. The audio, at least, is still 11 kilohertz mono, so you could listen to it, I suppose, but the picture is basically unwatchable. The vibes of this thing are so weird, though, that I'm not convinced it was supposed to be watched. It seems more like the goal was just to produce a version of the film that would run on any computer with a CD-ROM drive, and by that standard, I think they achieved it. The bitrate on these files is just 716 kilobits per second. That's audio and video combined. That's less than half the rate of most MPEGs and considerably less than Kinesoft's release, which means that beyond fitting the whole movie on one disc and reducing the price of the product, it's also easier on your machine. Streaming this file off a CD-ROM puts much less strain on your PC's resources. The video is also completely uncompressed. It's just a series of plain 256 color bitmaps, and that may seem counterproductive. If they're targeting a low bit rate, wouldn't compression let them get a higher frame rate for the same number of bits per second? Well, it might, but it would also demand more CPU effort to decompress each frame. Here, your processor doesn't need to do much work. It just grabs bits from the disk and shoves them into video memory unmodified, and that lets it spend the least effort possible. I'm sure they did this in order to get this to run on a low-end 386, which would have been the most common hardware spec of the era. This is an intriguing achievement, but it seems like that's all it is, just a technical achievement. Surely nobody would want to watch the movie like this. It's a stunt more than anything, so what was the point? Why did someone bother pressing this onto a disc? I'm really not sure. This product is shrouded in even more mystery than the Kinesoft version. I can't find any mention of it online or in magazines. The only copy is on Internet Archive, and none of the leads that I followed have produced any information whatsoever. Like, there is a README on the disc, but the only thing in it are instructions on how to install video for Windows, and that's it. A copyright from Alpha and Omega, but no other information. Now, the disc itself also has Alpha and Omega printed on it, and it says it's copyrighted, but I wonder. I strongly suspect this is a pseudonym, not a real business. I mean, if we look at the back of the jewel case, it has a still from the movie and a brief blurb that sure does sound like a salesperson wrote it, but the whole thing has an incredibly amateur quality about it. The catalog numbers on the disc don't turn anything up, etc. Honestly, this kind of feels like it was made by a pirate group. I have nothing to back that up except for the total lack of any identifying info, but that's really enough. Any real business would have put their contact details in a file on the disk. To not do that suggests they didn't want to be found, and well, that was pretty common. There were an awful lot of fly-by-night shovelware vendors in this era, making actual pressed discs that were just full of poorly curated and questionably legal dumps of public FTPs, and there were even pirate groups that were having actual CDs made that were full of stolen programs. So it's possible, but it feels like it would take just a bit too much thinking and would be just a bit too commercially unviable for that to be the explanation. The fantasy in my head is that some group of hackers found out somehow that Kinesoft was releasing this movie on CD, and when they learned that it was going to take 2 discs and would barely run on the kind of PC that most people had, they just got bugs up their asses about it and decided to show these guys how it's done. Is there any truth to this? I don't know. I doubt anyone will ever really know except the people who made it, but it just feels like too much of a coincidence to not wonder. All this is just so strange. It really comes down to that new old saw. If I had a nickel for every time It's a Wonderful Life got published on CD-ROM for computers too slow to play it, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. But what isn't weird is that Kinesoft were not the only ones to attempt this. As mentioned, I've got 3 other titles here. A Hard Day's Night, this is Spinal Tap, and I got them backwards. A Hard Day's Night, this is Spinal Tap, and A Night to Remember, all of which were released by Voyager. Now, some of you will have perked up at that name, I suspect, because Voyager was another operating name for the same company that runs Janus Films and the Criterion Collection. The relationship between these three entities is actually kind of confusing, though. I actually found one or two articles that seemed to imply that Voyager was solely responsible for publishing CD-ROMs, but as far as I can tell, this was just the name of the combined company all along. It's just that when they started making CDs, they chose to publish them under the Voyager name directly for some reason. This happened around 1989, and that year they released what is supposedly the first consumer-oriented CD-ROM title, CD Companion for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. This is sufficiently rare that I couldn't find a picture of the actual disc, but the software is kicking around, and in short, it's just a hypercard stack, offering a collection of information of all sorts, like a biography of the composer and a variety of deep dives into the composition of the piece, you know, that sort of thing. This would later get republished by Microsoft in 1994 for Windows, and per one unsourced claim, it raked in $33 million in revenue. I don't know if that's accurate, but it was, if nothing else, a very early example of the multimedia phenomenon. InfoWorld, in fact, covered it in a 1990 article on Multimedia, in which they also said that they estimated the deployment base for CD-ROMs in both PCs and Macs at a combined total of perhaps 40,000. So the folks at Voyager were pretty far ahead of the curve, and they went on to produce quite a library. Their 1995 sampler CD, advertising their CD-ROM library, covers at least 47 titles, ranging from a complete copy of Art Spiegelman's Mouse to a non-fiction nature documentary co-written by Douglas Adams. These must have sold in decent quantity because I've been able to find almost the entire collection on eBay. I'm admittedly tempted to assemble the whole set, but I chose to pick up just the ones that appear to be actual feature films. That's these three, and then a fourth called Salt of the Earth, which I bought, but I couldn't get it before I needed to shoot this video. I don't think that'll be a problem though, as you'll see. I think we can figure out what it would have been. Now, as far as I can tell, these are the only feature films that Voyager published. Almost all the other discs in their portfolio had video on them, some quite a lot, in fact, but none of it seems to be, a movie you might go see in the theater or rent on tape. The bulk of the collection is a mix of multimedia-specific art projects and companion discs for various films or TV programs. There's one for ephemeral films, for instance. That's a Rick Prelinger, whatever. A Rick Prelinger project about advertisements and instructional films, largely from the 50s, but it's not a complete movie, it's just a bunch of clips.
Madam, will you tell us what suds mean to you in washing?
Suds? Why, I want lots of suds. Every woman does.
Others, like that Douglas Adams joint, are nothing but still images and audio files from what I can tell.
This isn't at all what I expected. In 1985, by some sort of journalistic accident, I was sent to Madagascar with Mark Carwardine to look for an almost extinct form of lemur called the aye-aye.
A couple of them do offer hour-long documentaries, but they're things you might have seen on PBS at best, not in a theater. As far as real movies, it just seems to be the four. Now, I happen to get my three in chronological order of release, 93, 94, and 96. So we'll go in that order, starting with the one that's most likely to get me a copyright strike. A Hard Day's Night comes on just one disc, and there's not much in the box. For a moment, you're sort of hoping there's going to be some what they used to call feelies, but these are just instructions for how to install the software, which is the same as every other program on Windows. A warranty card, and then this is a catalog of Voyager's other titles, which I didn't realize unfolded like that. That's really inconvenient, but at any rate, nothing particularly fascinating, so let's just put the disc in. I should point out that, curiously, this is Windows only. This is really kind of strange because, well, Multimedia came to the Mac earlier, and it was kind of better at it, certainly for a while, and certainly at the low end of the Mac market at this time. And most of the other software in all of this is Mac compatible. I think this one isn't. Yeah, this is Windows only, but I believe the files will play on a Mac. And the other two titles here and almost everything else in Voyager's library, all Mac compatible. This is the only one among it all that's not. And it seems really weird now that I think about it. At any rate, I'm not sure why this is, but even though almost 100% of the data is on the CD, none of these will run from the CD directly. You always have to install something, and it creates a little Windows program group, but it doesn't seem like that should be necessary. At any rate, we fire up the app, and we get the famous chord, and then it's right on to a menu that pretty closely resembles the one from Kinesoft's disc. It's just a dry listing of everything the disc offers. And pretty much all these go to the same place, so we're just gonna start the movie itself. This loads a lot faster than the Kinesoft disc, I should mention. Anyway, this is the player interface, and it gets immediately into the movie, which I'm going to mute for obvious reasons. We start out with the video in a tiny window, since they had to assume you're on a low-end 486 at best. In fact, okay, yeah, I forgot to check this before. The requirements on the box are a 486 SX25, which is what this machine shipped with. So they're not claiming this would work at all on a 386, which was probably the right call. But even on here, it's not too great. It's kind of choppy in the small window, but if we hit the format button, this makes it much bigger. Oh, and actually, you know what? It's still running okay. When I tested this before, it was a bit more choppy, but I was probably on the base 25 megahertz processor. This is on the 50 megahertz, and it seems to run just fine. Now, my desktop is at 640 by 480, and the picture takes up, I think, a little under half the screen. So we can assume this is being displayed at 1:1, and it can't be resized. This is as big as it gets. There's also no exclusive full screen option. So although this is performing better than Kinesoft's did at the same resolution, there's no way to make it run as efficiently as this did in exclusive mode. And if you run your desktop at 800 by 600 or even higher, the video is going to look like a postage stamp. And that may sound unlikely to some. I think a lot of people think of Windows 3 as something that only ever ran at 640 by 480, but it's not true at all. Higher resolutions were pretty much universal by the time Windows 3 came out, and this computer advertises 1024 by 768 support right on top, so you may very well have been running at that resolution. Windows 3 also can't change resolutions on the fly. You actually have to shut down, reinstall your video drivers, and restart. It's incredibly inconvenient, but also not uncommon for the era. And most multimedia software expected you to run in 640 by 480 well into the Windows 98 period, so very likely you'd have expected this. It's not really a big deal. Now, going back to the video here, you might recognize the controls under the movie as an embedded copy of QuickTime. And if we return to the original view, you can see them there as well. So that's clearly what they're doing. And this might be why there's no full screen. I don't think the contemporary Macs had a concept of exclusive mode, so maybe Apple didn't bother implementing it for the Windows version of QuickTime either. Kinesoft, on the other hand, was using an embedded Windows Media Player control, so it's no surprise if it had better support for native PC graphics. Anyway, as I mentioned, this UI is where 95% of the program happens, and in a lot of ways I think that's better than Kinesoft's approach, although it might not seem that way at first. The video is very tiny in this view, and that's partly because it's sharing the screen with a text commentary. Now, I'm not sure who wrote this, but it's 166 pages long and just kind of roams all over the place. I think it's partly chronological, but it's mostly just whatever the author could think of. And this is interesting stuff for sure, but this doesn't really feel like the best viewing experience, right? You have to click through this one page at a time. Like, what's the multimedia aspect adding here? Why not just read a book while watching the movie? This is a pretty bad first impression, but give it a minute, it'll start to make sense. To see the other features, we have to click on the Contents button down here, and this gives us a whole bunch of submenus. So for instance, Scene does what you'd expect. It lets us pick a scene from the movie. Now, I'm going to dwell on this for a moment because the way this is implemented under the hood is interesting. I'll talk about the video encoding and whatnot later, but what I will tell you for the moment is that unlike Kinesoft's disc, which has the entire movie in one big file, well, half on one disc and half on the other, this actually breaks the film up into 10 separate segments. Now, I thought it was one per chapter, but this is clearly way more than 10. However, this still confers some benefits because the scrub bar here under the video is very tiny. And if this represented the entire film, then if you moved 1 pixel, you'd jump like 10 minutes forward. In fact, that is a problem with the Kinesoft disc. The scrub bar is kind of inaccurate. Here, however, because this only covers 1/10 of the film, you can actually scrub without jumping all over the place. And then when you get to the end of one clip, you can see it loads, and then it starts the next one. And of course, that means that every time you hit the end of the current segment while watching it, there's a pause. Well, it switches files, but whatever. It's not like this was incredibly watchable to begin with. But what I came here to show you was the script menu, because just like Kinesoft's product, this includes the entire shooting script of the film. Now, at first, I thought this might be a transcript, like the Voyager staff had just transcribed the whole movie by hand. But if we skip to the On the Train chapter here, and then step forward a couple of pages, Here we go. We've got lines that begin with John long-suffering. That sort of detail that you'd only get from the original script. So this has certainly been reformatted. The layout isn't in standard script style, but given the limited screen real estate, that was probably necessary. Otherwise, this appears to be an authentic copy of the script. But here's what's much more interesting about that. You may have noticed, as I changed pages, that the video changed too. Just like Kinesoft's disc, the script is synced to the movie, but here it's much tighter. As we flip through it, the video always catches up. And if we hit play here, when it gets to the end of each page of script in the movie, the text updates on the screen to follow it. And there's no lengthy pause as we switch to another screen. I'm not sure how much of this I cut out, but sometimes when I hit the button to go to the script in Kinesoft's app, it took like over a minute to switch screens. I have no idea why. This, on the other hand, is pretty much instantaneous. It's perfectly synced at all times. It auto advances as the movie plays, and you can watch through the whole film like this, following the script the whole way. Not to harp. Who am I kidding? I'm harping. DVD and Blu-ray can't do this, and streaming services won't. Hell, even Kinesoft didn't. So then and now, this is a genuinely novel, neat, and useful feature. And there's more. They index the video in several different ways, not just by the script, but also by the music. So if we go into songs here and pick a song, it seeks to the point in the movie where they played that song, and the text field displays the credits for the song, when it was recorded and where, and some background on the writing. Likewise, if we go into the cast section and pick any of the actors, this takes us to their first appearance in the film and then a biography of the actor on the right. And there's actually 3 pages of information here on somebody who I think was a minor character. Wait, no. He played Bertie Wooster in Carry On Jeeves. Who am I kidding? This guy's an A-lister. The final section here is for the crew, the above-the-line credits, people who weren't actually actors. But, of course, none of them appear in the film itself, so there's nowhere to jump to. But when you pick one, it updates the text with a biography of that crew member, and then we get a headshot in the background. So this is all pretty good, honestly. It lets you explore all this stuff without leaving the movie. But it gets better, because all these sections are search indexed. So if we come down and hit find, this searches through everything, the biographies, the script, the whole 9 yards. Okay, I can't remember the first scene where Paul's grandfather appeared, so we type in grandfather, search. That's grandfaher. Let's try that again. Search, there we go. So it gets a whole bunch of hits out of the commentary, and if we go down here, if we go way down here, there we go. You also get hits in the cast and even the photo gallery, but if we want to see his first appearance in the movie, we just go to the first appearance in the script. That jumps us right there and indexes the video right there as well. So those are all the features that are related to the feature, but the remaining options in the menu are separate tangents that are probably of interest to somebody who's watching this. For instance, It's Trad and The Running are earlier works by the same director. We can watch the entirety of one of them and a clip of the other. There's also an interview with said director, Richard Lester. We have a copy of the original theatrical trailer, and then we have a photo gallery, which sadly doesn't have nearly as many pictures as Kinesoft managed to fit on their disc. There's only 25. Oh, and the final section here is credits. You'd think that would be for the film itself, but it's actually for the Voyager CD conversion. I can't blame them for that, but it's not what I expected. At any rate, that's all there is to it, so let's sum up what we have here. This is a pretty magnificent achievement. It's also even less watchable than the thing Kinesoft made, but I think for very good reasons. On a technical level, this is implemented very similarly to It's a Wonderful Life. The movie is stored in a handful of video files on the disc. The actual contents of those files are virtually the same. Like I said earlier, Cinepack was available in both Microsoft and Apple's video offerings. But as you might guess, since the whole thing fits on just one disc, they had to change something, and it was the resolution. Instead of 320 by 240, this is at 208 by 156. That brings the bitrate down to just 570 kilobits per second, which is a horrible thing to do to video. I mean, even Kinesoft, with their focus on single-speed CD-ROMs, still kept it above a megabit. This is almost half that, and that's just criminal, but I think it was also very deliberate. I think that Voyager were just really intent on fitting everything on a single CD to produce the smoothest possible experience. While Kinesoft's product requires you to switch discs if you drag the scrub bar too far or jump from the script to a late moment in the film, Hard Day's Night is a single, uninterrupted video with no irritating pop-ups to pull you out of it. The movie itself may not be full screen, but the app is, and you can just sit in a dark room and cruise through the whole film while digesting the metadata on the side. This is a tailored experience, and it's one that required some very careful juggling of the encoding to pull off. See, this being a movie about music, the listenability of that music was paramount, but the limitations of audio compression and storage in 1993 didn't really offer many options. MP3s didn't exist yet, and even if they did, your CPU was already at 100% utilization just decoding the video stream. So the audio in this, just like with Kinesoft's product, is totally uncompressed. That way your CPU doesn't have to do anything more than pull the bits off the disk and chuck them into RAM. Kinesoft, however, chose to prioritize picture quality over sound, so they gave 1100 kilobits to the video, and that left them with only 88 kilobits for audio. That limited them to 11 kilohertz mono, which was probably the right call. As I mentioned, It's a Wonderful Life doesn't have the best sound to begin with. It was shot in the 1940s, so it has incredibly crisp vocals and clipped and overdriven music, as was the style of the time. It comes through fairly legibly at 11 kilohertz, but the same would not have been true for the Beatles, recording geniuses that they were, 20 odd years later. With that low a sampling rate, it would have absolutely slaughtered their guitar work, let alone their complex multi-tracked vocals. It just wasn't an option. So with some of the bit rate that was freed up by the ruthless video compression, Voyager found space for 22 kilohertz audio. Ooh. It's not 44, and it's not stereo, and those are the things you'd really want here, but you just weren't getting them. Remember that uncompressed 44 kilohertz stereo is just CD audio, and we know exactly how much of that you can fit on a CD, 74 minutes, exactly. So you could only fit just over half the movie's soundtrack on a disc, and only if you didn't include, the movie. 22 kilohertz mono was all you were getting here, but it was a damn sight better than 11, so this was definitely the right call. But also, the lack of stereo doesn't really matter because the movie was recorded in mono, as was the album. All this just goes to show, though, how tough it was to pull this off at all. As I said earlier, movies just didn't fit on CD in 1983. There was no way around this. Nowadays, we have much better codecs that make that possible, but those in turn only work because we have absurdly overpowered CPUs and dedicated decoding cores on top of that. None of that stuff existed back then, so there was just no good way to pull this off. You couldn't really put a movie on CD. So it's fortunate that Voyager weren't really trying to do that. I think they recognized that the actual value of this was not in watching the movie, but once again, as a companion product, something that adds to the experience. The modern equivalent to flipping through a wiki page of a TV show while you're watching it, a thing I think we've probably all done. So while this version of the movie is even less watchable than Kinesoft's offering, it didn't really need to be any better because that's clearly not what you were meant to do with it. Voyager definitely intended this video to be nothing more than a reference. And for that, it's really handy. I mean, sure, you could just run the program while watching the movie on your TV, but, well, for one thing, a lot fewer people had their computer and TV in the same room back in 1993. And multimedia-capable laptops were incredibly rare at the time. Also, if you're having a conversation or writing an essay or something like that, it is undeniably a lot easier to just click a line in the script and go straight there rather than scrub to it on a videotape. And conversely, if you want to find a given point in the script but you can't remember the precise words to search for, it's certainly easier to just scrub to the relevant spot in the movie, and there you are in the script. But to do all this stuff, you need the entire film at hand. You don't actually need it to be watchable, though. The tiny thumbnail we get here is an adequate representation, and that's all it needs to be. So in this sense, I think that Voyager's product is superior to Kinesoft's. They certainly did a much better job than I expected when I bought the thing, but by emphasizing watchability in their encoding and UI, Kinesoft limited the value of the product as a companion guide. Trying to use it that way is clumsy and awkward. Switching to the script and back requires a really, really long pause, and you can't see the script and film at the same time. Each section of the UI is separate from all the others, and there was value to this in that For instance, they could display the script in its original format and include a lot more and bigger cast biographies and photos and whatnot, but it makes it much harder to follow the film while integrating all that extra reference material, and I think that was a poor choice. Voyager's product, on the other hand, lets you do just that. You can watch the movie in a tiny window while flipping through text on the side, the same exact thing I do with shows and movies nowadays. So I think this is a better product than Kinesoft's It's a Wonderful Life, but only in that way that you so often see when multiple companies enter a brand new market simultaneously, none of them knowing what they're doing until suddenly someone does. Archos did not make a bad MP3 player, nor were they unambitious, nor did they fail to see which way the wind was blowing. They were roundly thumped in the market by the iPod, but simply because Apple bet on a different approach and turned out to be right. Here, the distinction is even subtler. Kinesoft's product is inferior in my eyes just due to slight differences in UI geometry. And it could have gone either way. Had someone at this company happened to say, hey, you know, the movie ain't all that watchable, do we really need to put it on its own page? Maybe we would be looking at two nearly identical products here. It just didn't happen to play out like that. And since this market died pretty much instantly, Kinesoft only got one bite at the apple. Voyager, however, took another, and it tasted different. This is Spinal Tap. Who's on first? This title was released in 1994, and this actually did come as a 2-disc set. Well, there was supposed to be a little paper sleeve in there for this to go in. Oh, and this was also not supposed to have a piece of tape on it. Uh-oh. I did all my testing with this using a burned copy of the disc, so I never bothered cleaning this one up. This is very embarrassing. Let's not peel the data layer off. Are we good? Are we good? Are we good? Are we good? We're good. Anyway, so this came as a 2-disc set, but rather than the movie spanning the 2 discs, one contains the entire film, while the other is all bonus content. Let's start with the movie itself. Once again, I've already installed the software, so we'll just swap discs here. You'll notice there's 2 different programs here, one for the movie itself, one for the bonus disc. That's probably the right call because if you fire up the Kinesoft disc, but you're planning on watching something in the back half of the movie, it still forces you to put in the first disc. Irritating. Not uncommon for the era, but irritating. All right, we get a little intro. And then it goes straight into the film.
Hello, my name is Marty DeBerge. I'm a filmmaker. I make a lot of commercials. That little dog that chases the covered wagon underneath the sink, that was mine.
Which I'm now going to pause for, again, obvious reasons. To save us some time, there's not much new going on here on a technical level, just some minor tweaks. This is 276 by 160 Cinepack video at 670 kilobits. It's pretty much the same, except I think they've made it wider, because I believe the aspect ratio of the movie was wider. I should have checked that. The audio is still 22 kilohertz, but it's now in stereo, which is good because this movie was new enough to be shot in stereo. But the bitrate of the audio is roughly the same because it's now compressed. They went with a very lightweight codec called 80 PCM, and I haven't dived too deep into this, but I think the reason they could do this is that sound cards had native support for decoding this format, so it didn't increase the CPU load any. In any case, though, it doesn't make a huge difference. The movie still doesn't look or sound that great, and even on my 50 megahertz PC, I can only play it in small mode. If we make it large, it gets pretty damn choppy, and there's no exclusive full screen mode, so this is as good as it gets. So the content is largely unchanged, but what's new here is the UI, or lack thereof. Compared to A Hard Day's Night, this is massively simplified. We don't even get a table of contents when it starts because there is no contents to table. There's no script, there's no bios, there isn't even a scrub bar. I'm not kidding. We actually can't change where we are in the movie. There is nothing to like click and drag on. We get play and pause, and then buttons that look like they're gonna be like fast forward, rewind, or chapter skip, but they're actually single frame step for reasons that will become apparent later. If you want to navigate around in the film, your only options are map or snaps. The latter one is sort of like a chapter select, but it's not organized in any kind of sensible like order. It just, here's some pictures from the movie. This might be chronological. I haven't watched the film in too long, so I can't exactly remember when things happened, but there isn't actually like a contiguous line you can follow through the whole thing, so it doesn't matter anyway. You just have to hope that you know what you're looking for. What? This is a really weird way to do it. And the map is even stranger. As the name suggests, this is a chapter select, except it's organized by where in universe things happen in the movie. What? And that's pretty much it. You've got almost no other controls. There actually is a find feature here, which lets you search through the film, but it doesn't let you search through like the script. Or rather, if it is searching the script, you aren't allowed to see it. So we could type in drummer, for instance, and that takes us to their drummer, and we can step through each instance of that. But what are we searching? I don't know. And once we're here, there's no way to go back to where we were. It's really, really weird to do it this way, but this is how they did it. So thus far, this is pretty minimalist, to put it politely, but there's one neat feature we shouldn't skip over, and that's the soundtrack selector. The first option here, that's just the normal movie, but if we set this to track 2, this is a commentary by the band actors, out of character for once.
Hello, my name is Marty DeBerge.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Ooh, interesting chord.
A portrait in sound.
A portrait in sound. I'm Harry Shearer. I play Derek Smalls, the lead bass player in Spinal Tap.
Hello, my name is Bill, and I'm an alcoholic. How's that?
And option 3, the crew, is another commentary track recorded by the director and producer, also out of character. At least I think so.
Hello, my name is Marty DeBerge.
I'm Rob Reiner. I directed Spinal Tap. I'm also one of the creators and writers, and play the part of Marty DeBerge in the film.
Talk about your...
That hat that Rob is wearing is a personal triumph of mine. He liked that hat. He wanted to wear that hat, but it was originally some, famous USS Marines ship hat. So I personally sat down on the set with a sewing needle and yellow thread, and I closed up letters. So a C became an O, so that no one would know what it said.
Now, to be clear, these are not exclusives. They also appeared on the Laserdisc released the same year by the same company. Voyager owned the rights to that, having, made it, so it would have been nuts to not bring these over. And I wanted to shortchange this whole thing because that's all you get. But yesterday I got a comment from a patron that sort of made me reevaluate it. They said that they owned this disc back in the day and that they absolutely adored it just for these commentary tracks. Like, they watched it over and over and over and over because they just loved the film and they couldn't get enough of hearing those commentary tracks over and over. And I'm going to talk about this more near the end of the video, but I do have limited perspective on all this stuff. So I was all prepared to sort of write this off for that being the only feature, but I think I was shortchanging it. Like I said, we'll talk more about that later, but all the same, this is all we get on the main disc. And even if it had some value, this still seems pretty underwhelming compared to all the stuff that we got on the Beatles CD. But let's switch over to the bonus CD and see if that makes up for it. So as I mentioned, we'll have to fire up a separate application to get to this. And make sure you're sitting down, because this is gonna rock your world. We fire up the app, we get the same little intro video, and then the absolute dictionary definition of a DVD extras menu appears. If you were to sit down and try to design the ideal example of a wacky DVD bonus menu, this would be it. It's spot on in terms of aesthetics and layout. This looks like it should be the extras menu for like High Fidelity or any number of films starring Adam Sandler or Tom Green. This was like a gut punch when this popped up on my screen. So here, my initial movie liker phase, where I was renting and watching dozens of movies a month for a couple years, occurred largely on a portable 14-inch Toshiba CRT television with a built-in DVD player. And I can't tell you why that was, since I had a PC with a DVD drive and a 1680 by 1050 LCD monitor, which would have been a much better experience in many ways, but that's how it was. So I understand why so many DVD menus looked like this. On a little phosphor screen, this is blindingly bright and cheerful and inviting. So it's no surprise that virtually every transfer house converged onto this style for any even remotely lighthearted movie, but none of those existed in 1994. There were no DVDs. There were no transfer houses to come up with screens that looked like this, and Laserdiscs didn't have menus. So it might be the case that Voyager invented this look. I'm not really kidding here, There was nothing to crib this from, so they can't have been copying anything else, and these were the Criterion people. They started releasing DVDs almost as soon as the format was available here, so it may actually be the case that the person who came up with this look also designed some early DVD menus to set the tone for the industry. I don't have the time or the resources to investigate that at the moment, but we can safely say that this would have been the only thing that looked like this at the time, so it's hard to discount the possibility. Anyway, spooky as that is, getting past it, this has pretty much what you'd expect from a DVD. We've got a bunch of ephemera of interest, mostly to collectors. The promotional films are just that. They're little non-trailers that the director made in order to drive interest in the movie. Then we have a bunch of deleted scenes. We can watch all those in their entirety. And the big film canister down here, that's the original short that Rob Reiner shot to show to studio execs to secure financing, and we can watch that too in its entirety.
Will you welcome back to the stage the heavy metal kings of England, Spinal Tap?
Are you a heavy metal fan?
Yes, I'm heavy
metal. What's the appeal?
You just listen to it and it gives you a good feeling.
The rest of the options here, however, are a bit strange. All these slides here take us to various sets of stills, but we view them through the movie interface. For instance, if we pull up the treatment and script, we get the video player. It starts out paused. It also starts out very small, so we want to set that to large so we can actually see anything. And we step through each of the images here using the frame skip buttons. So that's why those were in there. We can also hit play to zoom through these much more quickly. And then we hit pause once we get to where we think we want to be, but there's no like play backwards or rewind button. So if you overshoot, you have to stop and then step backwards one frame at a time. And you've probably skipped a lot of frames in the interim because this is not showing all the frames in real time. This is very odd for a bunch of reasons. Where do we start? For one thing, we now understand why they included the frame skip buttons, but why is it part of the movie player UI? Like, these are two different discs. So even if this one needs this interface, why doesn't the other one offer like normal fast forward and rewind or chapter skip or a scrub bar? And why are we using a video player to look at stills? As it turns out, it's because the stills are stored in video files. Each one of these segments is a .mov stored on the disk, and if we open it in a normal media player, there you go, we just got one frame per image. Oh, everything else is also in video files. The background, that's a QuickTime video. It's got one frame per possible UI layout. The controls are also a QuickTime video. There's one unique frame for each possible permutation of knobs and buttons. The bonus menu, that's a QuickTime video. Every pixel that you see on screen comes from a .mov file on the CD. And this seems like a really strange way to do things, and I have to assume they did it out of sheer practicality. All these images certainly could be independent files on the disk, but I guess each one would then have to be compressed independently and decompressed when loaded, and in this era, for whatever reason, loading a picture on a computer of this speed class usually took a measurable amount of time, like upwards of a second, whereas a QuickTime video can play anywhere from 4 to 12 frames per second. In other words, it can put a picture on the screen in 1/4 of a second max. That's not too bad. Plus, they already had a license for it, whereas an image library might have been a lot slower and cost more money, so that's my guess as to why they did it this way. None of this, though, explains why the UI isn't better tailored to it. Why is there no rewind button? Why is there no scrub bar? But in any case, you now know what the program does and how it does it. You've seen everything. So what do we think of this as a product? Well, it's quite a different thing, isn't it, compared to A Hard Day's Night. There's no biographies, there's no anthology of the director's past work, there's no breathless editorializing on the cultural impact of the movie, despite the fact that there was quite a lot of cultural impact. They didn't even include a decent copy of the script. There is a slideshow that seems to include the script, but it's very sloppily formatted and kind of hard to read. Why it's not just a text file is anyone's guess. So, to put it simply, this is much less informative than It's a Wonderful Life or the Beatles CD. It's not really a companion or reference guide. It's mostly just pure entertainment wrapped up in a fairly tedious and impractical UI. And I'm not sure what to think about that. With the other discs, I could brush off most of the user interface problems, especially the tiny, poor quality video, by looking at them as reference works first and movies second. Not to harp. Who am I kidding? I'm harping. I don't think you were really expected to sit down and watch these. The movies themselves were included as a visual reference, or at least that's what I'd like to think. Here, though, there's no question of the intent. If you put in disc 1 of the Spinal Tap set, there is nothing you can do with that other than watch the movie straight through. And You'd never really want to do that on this format. A VHS tape would be better in every way. I guess, like I said earlier, that the commentary tracks are probably the primary argument for this thing's existence, but if that was the intent, to deliver an experience that would only appeal to enthusiasts, then why is the script only viewable by switching discs and reading it awkwardly in the tiny video player? It just feels sloppy, poorly thought out, even compared to the other release from the same company. But given the pedigree of its creators, I can't help wondering if this was deliberate. On the one hand, the movie's director, Rob Reiner, built the film on layers of irony. He opens the movie by pretending to be an incompetent nobody.
That little dog that chases the covered wagon underneath the sink, that was mine.
And he also made a promotional film where he says the only value of the movie is that it contains naked women, before leading into an absurd short about cheese rolling.
Oh, hi. I didn't see you come in.
We've got sex. We've got nudity.
The call of the Alpenhorn echoes across the Danskin Peninsula, the heart of Denmark's cheese belt.
Reiner is clearly prone to mocking his own work, and that surely sets the tone for the whole production. So you might be surprised if you listen to the crew commentary track, which opens with Reiner saying that he thinks commentary tracks are a bad idea, in the most serious tone imaginable.
My feeling about it is, to dissect a film like this and to discuss it in such detail, what it tends to do is demystify what you've done. And to me, it's like, a magician telling the audience how he did a trick. And I could tell you things about this film that will take away, I believe, your pleasure of seeing the film. And I feel that it's not the best thing to be doing.
You can't really tell if he means it or not. Like, if he means it, then why is he here recording the commentary? Was it just for the paycheck? It's hard to believe he needed the work that badly. Is it just more K-fob? Maybe, but I personally think he's dead serious. The joy of Spinal Tap, for many, comes from the absurdity of someone having actually made this utter cringe fest. So Reiner appears at the beginning of the movie to give you a crystal clear picture of the kind of guy who would actually do this in all good faith and sincerity in order to make it gel. You may know, in your mind, intellectually, that it's all a joke, but the verisimilitude of the whole thing holds it together. It keeps you doubting. Reiner's worry is that if you absorb too much background info, if you look behind the curtain for too long, you might lose that spark, the tiny doubt floating in the back of your mind that keeps saying, are we sure these guys aren't serious? And he has a point. Those of us who have watched the same movie dozens of times, read all the behind-the-scenes details we can dredge up, and debated with friends over whether a smudge we can barely see under the film grain is actually a crew member who wandered into frame, have undeniably lost something in the process. The begged question is whether that matters, and whether it's the director's job to control or even to worry about how we experience his movie. Answering that is an exercise for the reader, and I guess Rob Reiner, but my point is that very little of the content in this 2-disc set, other than the commentary tracks, serves to dilute that magic. And maybe that was at his request. The promotional films, the deleted scenes, the stills on the bonus disc, they're all pretty much diegetic. The presentation of the film inside a silly mock-up of an amplifier is in keeping with the absurd tone of the rest of the production, and arguably even the crappy chapter select enhances things. And sure, DVDs didn't exist yet, but if they did, and if you were releasing a heavily self-referential parody film, wouldn't it make sense for it to also mock the awkward navigation style of DVD menus? In other words, maybe this is bad on purpose. Once again, we have to wonder if Voyager's producers were just way ahead of the curve. It's moot, though, because all I really have here is guesswork. I don't know what their intentions were, and I don't expect any of the principals to get back to me if I ask, so all I can do is look at this as a consumer might. And unfortunately, in this case, it's really hard to put myself in the right shoes. Not just because of my modern perspective, but because of my contemporary one. For one thing, I'm at a disadvantage here because I'm very attuned to visual quality. I'm the guy who breathed a sigh of relief when Blu-ray came out, then another one when UHD Blu-ray dropped. Each increase in fidelity has made me feel more connected to what I'm watching, and it bugs me when I have to watch something even in standard definition. Now, don't get me wrong, if the only version of a movie I can get is a poorly transferred DVD, I'll watch it, and I'll enjoy it just fine. But if I know that there's a better version out there, it's really hard to accept a crappy one. Now, at the time this came out, you could have just rented this movie on VHS, and it would look 100 times better. And I know that I would have insisted on watching it like that. The question is whether I represent a significant part of the audience, and I really doubt that I do. My memories of computing start in the mid-90s. I don't recall anything before about 94, 95, and while I do remember the first time I saw a video playing on my PC, I also remember thinking, wow, that looks like crap. We had a big TV and a good VCR. We rented movies on VHS regularly, and that was my frame of reference. So when I saw the Weezer video, even as a literal child, I rolled my eyes at the crushed colors and minuscule resolution. I've always been like this. It's a curse. I was too young at the time to appreciate either of these movies properly, but of the two, I'd certainly have picked Spinal Tap, and I think I would have immediately rejected it because it would have been impossible for me to look past the nature of the program itself. As soon as I saw the MPEG block, they're not MPEG blocks, you know what I'm saying. As soon as I saw the compression and the dithering, it would have stopped feeling like watching a movie and felt like running a program. I don't know how else to put it. There was a very specific tone to multimedia discs, and this one has it. But would I feel that way if I was, say, 22 at the time? Probably not. I mean, to wit, the patron I mentioned earlier clearly didn't feel that way. To me, however, computers have always existed, and before I ever watched mine play bit-crushed low-res Weezer, I watched it run Doom at a buttery smooth 35 FPS with graphics that were tailored to the display's limitations instead of mutilated to fit into them. So I went into this expecting a higher standard of visual quality than was actually possible. If, on the other hand, I'd been present for the 80s and seen the development of PC graphics, or indeed if this was my first computer, I might have been a lot more forgiving and a lot more appreciative. So frankly, I doubt that patron was alone. I expect to get a lot more comments from people saying that they had these and loved them. So we're almost ready to wrap up here, but first, we've got one more disc, A Night to Remember. This is mostly nothing new, but it is the end of Voyager's lineup as far as I know. This was the last one they released. So for the sake of completeness, let's just skim through some footage I captured earlier. Once again, this includes the entirety of the 1958 film about the Titanic, although it actually seems to play a little bit smoother, even in large mode, than the other movies. I'm not sure why. The files are basically identical, so the actual player software must be improved in some way. It's strange, too, because this box says the minimum requirements are a 486 DX266, which is actually higher than this one, which says it needs a 486 SX25. So I thought they would have bumped up the video quality, but in fact, it's pretty much the same, yet I can play it in large mode with no problems. Weird. The player interface is also much better than the last two titles. Not only is there a full set of playback controls and a surprisingly responsive scrub bar, they've integrated everything into a custom UI. There are chapter skip buttons now, although no immediate chapter list. We'll get to that in a moment. There's also a commentary switch, though. While this movie's too old to have a crew commentary as such, Voyager got a couple of historians to come in and record one, and there's quite a lot of actual historical info in there, so it seems like a worthwhile listen.
But up on top, they're still serving liquor, which I don't think really happened because several people mentioned that the bars were closed, and they couldn't get a drink if they wanted to. I'm sure some people did manage. Excitement of the rockets going off, which one of the survivors told us looked exactly like rockets on the 4th of July.
I am disappointed, though, that they didn't reproduce the sound the way it really was. It was just a loud cannon report. And in the film here, it's only a little crackling sound.
What's most interesting, however, is the search button. We can search the movie for a given string of text, and we've seen two other movies that could do this, but I neglected to comment on how it was possible in the Spinal Tap one. In the Beatles one, it's obvious, it's just searching the script, but Spinal Tap didn't include the script, so what was it searching? I forgot to dig into this, but when I got to A Night to Remember, I decided to figure out what was going on, and I couldn't until I opened the movie on my PC and discovered that there's a subtitle track. I turned that on, and banners, grandstand dignitaries, big wig, top hats, Union Jack, Garland Queen. We didn't start the fire. It looks like Voyager had someone go through and annotate every single shot in the film with a transcript and a description of every object and concept on the screen. Then they packed all that into the subtitle track, which syncs it with the video. This is frankly a brilliant way to do it, and I'm sure it's how they did it in the Spinal Tap one as well. But it does make you wish they included actual subtitles, since apparently the format supported it. I guess you can't have everything though, and it's not like they didn't earn their keep in other ways. The movie is indexed from 3 different directions: by timeline, by blueprint, and by passenger. And each of these took quite a bit of effort. If we start with the timeline, this is basically just a chapter list, if you think about it, but they've illustrated it with 3D renders of the ship's progress, showing you where it was and what time of day at each point in the trip. The images are so big that they take quite a while to load, which prevents you from just zipping through the timeline. It's kind of a shame, but I get what they were driving at, and it's frankly a really cute way to do it. And of course, once you find an interesting scene, you can just click on the text to jump to it in the video. Next up, we have the blueprint section. This is also exactly what it sounds like. You pick a deck on the ship, then you pick a room within that deck, you get a description of that room's function and its role in the story, and then a list of scenes set there. Now, I really love this. When you select a scene, you don't jump back to the main film viewer, it just plays the clip embedded directly in the page.
I'm going to have to cut down more steam. I'll have to get rid of some of the load, Denson.
Not only that, but the scrub bar is constrained to just that scene, which is interesting because that's not how it's laid out on the disc. This is selecting a small segment from the larger video clip, which they clearly didn't know how to do back in 1993. Voyager seemed to be getting better at their job. Finally, we have the passenger log. That's also exactly what it sounds like. Well, sort of. Actually, the name is misleading because it includes passengers and crew, but at any rate, for each one, we get a biography, then a list of scenes they're in, and again, selecting a scene plays it in situ.
Messages for the captain. Oh, very good, Bugs.
So that's everything that's on the disc. There is a second bonus CD in this one as well, but that just contains one thing, an hour-long documentary on the making of the film. It seems really well produced and information dense, at least from my skimming it. But of course, this was originally included on the Laserdisc released a year prior, as was the commentary track, which explains the high budget. So we can see at this point that all three of these are pretty much just boiled down, more interactive versions of their Laserdisc releases, which makes a lot of sense. Anyway, there it is. Those are all the movies I could get a hold of. I haven't been able to look at Salt of the Earth yet. It's going to come in the mail in a day or two, but I'm pretty confident it's not going to be too different from the others. So what do we think of all of this? Once again, it's kind of hard for me to say. As I remarked a couple minutes ago, I don't really think I have the contemporary perspective to understand the value of these titles in context. I can say, objectively, that each one provides a ton of value, loads of behind-the-scenes information that would have been very tough for many people to get, and in some cases, it's more usable and accessible than the Laserdisc would have been. But was that enough to make these broadly appealing? I don't really know, and I'm not going to try to opine any further on it. Hopefully, like I said, a few people who remember these will comment with their experiences. But what I can say is that, as with most multimedia-era products, it's clear that Voyager were seesawing back and forth as they tried to figure out the best way to make this sort of thing work. Hard Day's Night takes a highly encyclopedic approach. Spinal Tap is basically just an early attempt at making a DVD that focuses on pure entertainment, and A Night to Remember swings back the other way and ends up splitting the difference. Now, surely some of this was due to the tonal differences between these movies, but still, I think we're witnessing the process of an art form being invented here. Unfortunately, as far as I know, this was the end point of that process. The Titanic CD came out in 1996, and as far as I can tell, that was the last one they put out. It's also the same year that DVD was formally announced, and I don't know how long it took for players to appear in people's homes. Criterion also wouldn't get their first DVD release out until 1998, but I think it was obvious to them that the meta was about to change and that they should stop putting effort into these. And that probably made sense because, at least in my observation, the multimedia era was coming to a close. Not to suggest that people stopped selling CD-ROMs with weird interactive textbooks on them overnight, but it rapidly became less talked about for a whole bunch of reasons. Frankly, multimedia always looked to me, even in its heyday, as an attempt to fill a void, a solution looking for a problem. People were buying computers in the early 90s that were a lot more powerful and capable than they needed to be for the tasks they were being used for. So when someone went to Egghead Software or Circuit City and saw programs on the shelf, they tended to buy them just to have something to do with their expensive investment. In the late 90s, however, this started to shift rapidly. Computer games became a lot better and more popular, the internet started to really take off, MP3s appeared. If you were desperate for something to do on your PC, there were suddenly much better options than buying Castle Explorer or Jazz: A Multimedia History. And on the flip side, while Criterion et al. May have felt constrained by the limitations of Laserdisc, DVD was clearly about to lift most of them. I mean, sure, a few of the highly interactive features on here weren't possible, like the full-text search, but just about everything else that we've seen would be more or less doable. You could totally build a DVD menu that mapped the chapters in this film to a blueprint or to a passenger list. I'm pretty sure I've seen that before. And while you couldn't embed the video player in the page, that was a pretty minor limitation compared to the immense improvements in ease of use and quality. Did Criterion end up making any discs like that? I don't know, but they certainly would have realized at this point that if they were going to spend the effort, it made more sense to spend it on a DVD. And for all I know, maybe it was possible to include most of those things, just not on a normal set-top player. I know that there were lots of DVDs, and Blu-rays for that matter, that you could put in your PC to see exclusive software-based features. Maybe things like searchable scripts lived on in that form. I don't know, because I always brushed it off. I always assumed that it would just be worthless space-filling fluff because that's what was on the first couple of DVDs I looked at. It was like crappy Shockwave games, links to the studio website, and not much more. So I just assumed that everything else was like that and didn't bother looking any deeper. But from some quick Googling, it seems that at least a handful of DVDs did include screenplays and who knows what else. So I'm kind of kicking myself now. As a pixel peeper, as someone who obsesses over details in the films I like, the curtain was whipped back for me decades ago, and there it remains. I can't remember the last time I watched a movie without opening Wikipedia, okay? I mean, hell, I often make decisions about what films I want to see based on the production notes. So I generally disagree with Reiner. The magic is not diluted by the additional background information, at least not for me. And if I'd had this kind of experience available in the mid-2000s, when online resources weren't what they are now, I'd have eaten it up. I can't even imagine what it was like to have this in 1994. So I have to commend both Voyager and Kinesoft. While it's pretty obvious that they gave up on these ventures after just a couple forays, it's impressive that both companies saw the potential in the medium so clearly and so early on that they were willing to put out what must have been an obscene amount of money and effort to realize them when nobody else was. While there aren't many magazine articles that mention Kinesoft's disc, there are plenty that describe Voyager's feature releases, alongside several other multimedia ventures, but even the reviews that seem comprehensive don't mention any other companies releasing full-length movies like this. So I think it was just these. But despite that, it's yet another reminder to me that the risks people were willing to take 30 years ago were very different, and companies were much bolder than they are now. These days, it feels like a year goes by and the only new products that hit the market are either straight up scams or things you already had with arguably minor changes. Startups appear constantly, but they all seem to make things people don't want or that don't really work. Meanwhile, there are plenty of things we could have for which the technology is there, but they never materialize because there just isn't $1 billion to be had in it. When we look back on the past, there are so many things that may have been failures, maybe even bad ideas outright, but they were at least completely new ideas that someone bothered to bring to fruition. I wonder what we could have right now if there were companies out there willing to experiment as hard as these two did. Who can say? But, as is tradition for my channel, having delivered the old cynical chestnut, we are now at the end of the video. Thanks for watching! I hope you enjoyed it, because it took way too long to produce. As in, this was supposed to come out before Christmas. We're now so far into January that I can't even say Happy New Year in good faith, though I just did, so you'll have to accept it. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel. I try to make things at least this interesting as often as I can, so remember to turn on notifications if you want to find out when I upload new stuff, but if you really enjoyed this, consider subscribing to my Patreon like these folks have. This is my full-time job, and my patrons are the only reason I have the time, space, and money to buy period-correct hardware like this pristine Packard Bell, and to do all the repair and maintenance to keep that hardware working, such as when the power supply blew up the day before I was supposed to shoot, and to have the time it takes to research and experiment and get things right, or at least as right as I can manage. They also pay for my rent and groceries so I can, continue living. So I'm incredibly grateful to all of them. Thank you all so much for supporting me, and to everyone else, thanks for watching.